time I gave lenses any real consideration was my first semester of grad school. We had just gotten our first batch of essays back, and our professor asked us to nail down what the heck we meant when we said lens. Words like lens and frames we've been throwing around pretty much meaninglessly and definitely with some pretension. Most of us were still shocked that we had gotten into grad school. Most of us had imposter syndrome to such a great extent that one of the early seminar topics that we heard from every single teacher was, hey, you're going to be feeling some imposter syndrome. Let's talk about what that is and how you can work to overcome that. And we were feeling it a lot. And so instead of just bringing our thoughts to the table, we brought all this language of historians, lens and frame and Marxist this and feminist that, and just a lot of posturing, trying to show, oh, I can speak the language. Like, well, no, you don't know what you're talking about, is what she said. She wouldn't let it go until we actually nailed down what we meant by lens. And that's where we're gonna start here. What the heck is a lens? Most simply, a lens is a piece of glass where when you look through it, you see something different than if you were just looking around the room. Lenses as a category can do all sorts of different things, but individual lenses are only going to have one purpose. So maybe you need glasses in order to read and it makes things seem closer up to you. Maybe you go outside a lot and you want the whole world to seem a little bit darker to protect your eyes. Or maybe you're a scientist and you need to see things that are very, very small or very, very far away and use microscopes and telescopes. Or maybe you're a security guard and you want to be able to see a whole room from just one camera, so you use a wide-angle lens. What all of these have in common is an element of distortion. They don't show you what's there, they help you understand what's there. So what you're getting isn't the exact truth, and that's why this is such a good metaphor for history, because history, it's not just all of the facts of the past, it's facts plus interpretation. We use concept, chronology, and characters in order to create a narrative where there really isn't a narrative. Sometimes this is obscured by how we like to treat our past, as if it's a story, but really most historic actors were just people. They did regular people things just like anybody else, and sure, they did a lot of great things, but most of their time was taken up by the same banalities as anybody else. It's doubtful they even thought of themselves as a historic player. They probably thought of themselves as being on the cutting edge of the future, because that's what they were. No matter when somebody considers to be the present, the past will always be dead and gone. But the future will always be unwritten. And so people don't live their lives as if they're going to be characters in a history book written to contextualize somebody else. The sheer humanness of our drive to create meaning for ourselves and for our contemporaries mean that we don't fit neatly into a historic narrative. And usually, in order to make some semblance of sense, we have to do a certain amount of editing. Ergo distorting. It may have already crossed your mind that my eyewear does not seem particularly well suited to the situation in which I find myself. Beside the fact that I do not wear glasses but nonetheless wanted some kind of eyewear for this video, I am making a point about when you use each lens. Lenses distort, but they distort with a purpose. You use a lens in order to see something, an object, or an idea about a concept better. But you can use lenses improperly, like wearing sunglasses inside or writing a Marxist economic theory about ancient Greece. I mean, you could do it. I don't know how much sense it would make, but you could. I've given some thought to this question of what is a lens in the last few years, and what I'm going to be using in this video is way of knowing. A Marxist lens is a Marxist way of knowing, a feminist lens is a feminist way of knowing, a queer lens is a queer way of knowing, and so on. Essentially, what a historian is saying is that this way of knowing is relevant to this group of people because of these experiences, and in accordance with both these facts, this is going to show how the past and the present interplay for this group of people. That's the meaning with which I'm going to be proceeding, but it does beg the question, why do we need ways of knowing? Why isn't the truth good enough? The answer, or at least my answer, is pretty simple. The facts alone aren't enough because they're heinously boring. If you've ever been in a history class and you've been frustrated and bored by reading New Deal alphabet soup or memorizing states' capitals or any other tedious and boring process where you are technically learning facts but you're reading them with no interpretation and no context, it's completely meaningless. So just because something is true doesn't mean that it's interesting or important. And this is too bad because history itself is pretty awesome. But qualifiers like interesting, important, and awesome, they don't exist in and of themselves. Something has to be these things to someone. And because history has to mean something to someone, well, that puts us, the consumers of history, right in the center of the historic process. And just about every history book is going to start and or end with a story about why that book was written. The facts of a history don't change much from one history to another. What changes is the interpretation of those facts. I mean, unless of course we find an old trunk full of Hitler's wartime diaries, in which case we would have new facts. But barring something like that happening, usually it's all about the takeaways. What does this past mean to us today? One history or another is going to matter because one group of descendants or another group of intellectual inheritors are still going to be impacted by the events of the past. And that still impacted is a moving target. And so something that's impacted in one way at one time is going to be impactful in another way at another time. And so we have to keep telling the story. As society evolves, so do our thoughts, and that brings us back to lenses. Historical lenses are ways of thinking about and making meaning about the past. And because there are so many different people in the world, we have a lot of different ways to understand the importance of things that happened in the past. Let's take the Civil War as an example. Eric Foner wrote the definitive history of the Civil War, but Drew Faust still had room to write an emotional history of the Civil War. Biographies are another category. Ron Chernow wrote Grant, which covers his whole life, and the war is just a part, although an important part. And then you've got James McPherson, who wrote a biography of Jefferson Davis that focuses solely on the war years, even though he had a career before that. So what we have is a set of 4 different histories, which all come from the same basic reservoir of information, and they're not written to the exclusion of each other, but they are meant for different audiences with different preferences, and they serve different purposes within the historiographical canon. Now, you may have noticed that I am not the only one with a lens. At this very minute, I have a lens trained on me. You're looking at me, making me an object in my own analysis. I like to see myself certain ways, but you could see me entirely differently. Nonetheless, I want to be seen, but I want you to see me how I see myself. So I provided you a lens to see me on my terms. This means I get to show you some things and I get not to show you other things. And in order to demonstrate this, let me show you how I prepared for this video. If my bedroom looks like it exploded, it's because I've been living out of a suitcase for the last 2 months while hiding from coronavirus at my mom's house. That's right, this isn't even my bedroom, it's my mom's guest room. All of this information doesn't change the actual video you're seeing, but it does change your understanding of what you're seeing. And even though the conceit of this footage is to show you behind the scenes, there's still framing devices that I'm using in order to put myself in one light or another. I've sped up the film so that I look more industrious in my cleaning, and you'll notice that I'm dressed and my hair and makeup are done, even though you won't even see my eye makeup in this video. I mention all of this because historic figures do this too. Journals, letters, internal memos, propaganda, it's all meant to be consumed with either a contemporary or a historic slant. People are aware that they're being observed, and the higher up somebody is in terms of power or influence or impact on the world, the more aware they are. We might have more material, but they're more aware that they're being watched. But there's a caveat. People can only prepare for what they know, and new lenses are being invented all the time. John Adams never lived to see the invention of cameras, but his son, John Quincy Adams, was the first president to be photographed. What neither of them could have predicted is being portrayed in the 2008 HBO miniseries John Adams, which is a very literal lens, in a time period when founders chic was all the rage, which is the historical lens. What I'm getting at is that people in history weren't the passive subjects of study. They were active in curating their own image. It follows that history is a co-creation between them and us in the present who study them. They made the decisions, and we're the ones who need to make meaning out of it. And humans are great at co-creating. We co-create all the time. Have you ever read Shakespeare? You and he have co-created a play. Have you read the Declaration of Independence? You and Jefferson did a co-creation. If you're watching this video right now, you and I are co-creating. I may have posted it online, but without you watching, this is a dead end. But I've got to ask, what about all the stuff in between? It's not like Shakespeare wrote The Taming of the Shrew, let it sit on a shelf for 400 years, nothing happened, and then you read it. No, people lived and died and thought and wrote. We fought wars and we invented many, many lenses along the way. For example, a feminist could read The Taming of the Shrew in ways that Shakespeare never could have predicted. For that matter, so could a Marxist, but one of those two is going to be a lot more productive than the other. This leads me to think that you can obscure a lot of information if you become too reliant on lenses in general, or worse, one lens in particular. Feminism makes some sense here because the play is all about how to be a woman and a good woman and to make meaning in your life and meaningful decisions in a world that's controlled by men. I've also read economic interpretations of The Taming of the Shrew, and these work because the characters are constantly making decisions about things. But a Marxist interpretation of The Taming of the Shrew wouldn't make much sense. One, because the story isn't about class structure, because two, class structure, like we understand it today, hadn't been invented yet. Essentially, history is all about us, the consumers of these stories. We want to feel contextualized, we want to feel like we matter. And in all of this wishy-washy humanitarian soup, can history even be wrong? Oh yeah. The most obvious way that history can be wrong is if the facts are inaccurate. We don't argue about when the Civil War started, or even the fact that it started about slavery. We do argue about what the meaning of the Civil War was, and if we should pay reparations to Black families who were injured personally and economically between slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, mass incarcerations, etc. So if the facts are all correct, are we good to say whatever we want? Not quite. In addition to having incorrect facts, you can also have interpretation that's flawed. When I was an intern at historic Stagville Plantation, we were trained on how to talk to children about slaves. While adults generally have some idea of how institutions and institutionalized violence work, kids will say things like, "If I was a slave, I'd run away." And what they maybe do or maybe don't realize that they're then getting at is, since slaves didn't run away, they're complicit in their own enslavement, which isn't the takeaway you want them to get from their field trip to the plantation. So in order to get them thinking, you can ask them questions. Which way is north? How far is it to the nearest town? Do you think that you'll find people who will help you there? How far is Canada? What if you get kidnapped and brought back sometime along the way? What are you going to eat while you're there? Is anybody going to help you? How are you going to find those people? And are you ever going to see your family again? These are all questions that get kids thinking about why maybe somebody wouldn't have run away, or all of the barriers to them running away. It helps kids to understand what it means to be well and truly trapped, and that people who are victims can't be blamed for their situation. And kids aren't the only ones who make mistakes. Sometimes it's professional historians who screw up. For example, Stanley Elkins wrote a book in 1959 called Slavery, which argues that the process of coming to America and the process of enslavement means that all culture of African Americans was lost in the transfer. Now, he uses psychology as a source. Psychology can be used in history. It's a little bit touchy whether or not and exactly how you can use it, but it can be used. However, the psychologist that Stanley Elkins used was already controversial in his assertions of how memory works and how trauma will affect people. In addition to this, Stanley Elkins wrote his book right before there was a lot of Black history and Black studies research done. So by 1974, he had rescinded his entire own book. He admitted in his own afterword in 1974 that his work wasn't particularly productive and the ideas that he puts forth weren't necessarily the best interpretations of the facts. In fact, Elkins encourages his readers to go read the Black studies work done by Black scholars. I didn't think much more about Stanley Elkins until I took a beach vacation several months later. I sat on the beach reading Anne Rice's Armand, and I got to a very familiar seeming passage. Memory had already been choked out of me along with language or any capacity to reason in a consistent way. I remember the squalid rooms that must have been Constantinople because the other people talked, and for the first time in forever, since I'd been ripped out of what I couldn't remember, I could understand what people said. This book was written in 1998, almost 40 years after Stanley Elkins' book, and almost 25 years after he announced that he didn't stand by it anymore. To be clear, I'm not saying that Anne Rice read a 40-year-old book about American slavery and thought, well, this sounds like good character development. No. I'm also not saying that it's inconceivable that she would have done some research into the psychological facets of being enslaved because she was writing from the point of view of an enslaved character. What I am saying is that this same wrong idea got picked up and reinterpreted, showing that historians' interpretive lenses have uses beyond interpreting history. Ideas, philosophies, and lenses can help us understand the world, how we tell the story of the world, and what we can do with the world we're given. A really good example of this is Marx. He wrote a thought experiment which essentially argues that based on what we've seen of power in the world so far, eventually there will come a time when the proletariat classes will rise up and seize the means of production from the bourgeoisie classes who have been acting as a parasite because they don't need that anymore. This then becomes an idea that exists in the world, and it becomes some people's idea of how the world should be. A Marxist revolutionary might say, let's do it. But now we find ourselves at an interesting historical crossroads. Could Russia have had their revolution if it hadn't been for the roadmap being written for them? Maybe. Although a Marxist historical analysis of the Russian Revolution typically says that it was premature and that it was unsuccessful because it was premature. So maybe if they'd waited a little bit longer, if they hadn't had the map, if they were living history without an eye to the future in the way that they'd been given an eye to the future, well, maybe that would have worked out differently. The ideas that we have about the world and about the way that the world works become a part of the world, and so we as historians need to be responsible. As we established earlier, history is all about us. Media consumers, scholars, museum visitors, we all want to see ourselves in the history. This is why people get so upset when they're used to being front and center in a story and suddenly they find themselves in the blurry background, or worse, cropped out entirely of somebody else's telling of the same narrative. There are a variety of reasons why certain people have not been the focus of history. One of those reasons is sources. It's a lot harder to write a history when you don't have any documentary evidence. And when you're a slave and you don't know how to read and write, you're not going to leave a lot of written record. I ran into this problem when I was at historic Stagville Plantation trying to write a series of articles about women's experiences during wartime. I could find some sources for the white women, even though it was a little bit touchy, but I found almost nothing about the black women who were living there, and they did make up the majority of the population at historic Stagville, so that was a difficult thing. When I did find sources, they were being written about, like livestock, and that's also no good when you're trying to write a good history. I had to get creative, using secondary sources and reading memos from overseers across the grain in order to get whatever information I could get. People further along in their careers have struggled too, but in the last half century there's been a lot written about Black history and Black culture in this country, which leads you to think that if so much can be done with the sources we have, maybe there are other reasons for deprioritizing certain lenses of viewing history. A great counterexample to this is women's history. Women write a lot, and there have been feminists for over 150 years. We write and we write and we forget generation to generation. And one reason for this is that women aren't necessarily born to feminist parents. They have to go out and learn their history for themselves. But we're also not set up on a societal level to support women seeing themselves in history. In order to make them part of the historic narrative, you'd actually have to value women in the first place. This is what happens when we culturally and institutionally prioritize certain ways of knowing over other ways of knowing. Certain ways of knowing, certain perspectives, and certain lives get left out. And since history is such a powerful tool, how is it organized? Well, go through any textbook or in a Barnes & Noble and see how their history section is set up. We organize our historical thought around wars. There's other stuff too, but war sets the pace. We use wars in order to describe when stuff happens. Words like antebellum, Civil War, World War I, interwar period. When people ask me when something happens, I'm just as likely to tell them the name of a war as I am to tell them the date. Because while people might not know the numbers so well, they do know what happened, and they do know the rough order in which it happened. Military history is our way of communicating what borders were drawn and when and who lived where and why things happened and which ideas spread. And because this is our cultural shorthand, it's the dominant way that we view ourselves and the way that we view our history. This brings us back to the idea of history as something intended for the living. History contextualizes us, and everybody deserves that context, whether they are Black or gay or a woman or a soldier, or if you can trace your family all the way back to Julius Caesar. By virtue of existing in the world today, everybody has a right to feel like they belong in it, and history has an incredible power to make people feel like they belong or make people feel like they don't belong. This kind of inclusion is a positive good in and of itself, but is it history? Well, that's the easy part. Yes. As long as the facts are in order and the interpretation is done in good faith, yes, it is history. And the best part of this isn't like a hippy-dippy kumbaya thing either. Because everybody approaches history with a certain perspective and a lens, it's impossible to have an objective history, at least from any one perspective. But if you get your perspectives from across the board, from all kinds of different people who are alive today, eventually you will get closer to something that approximates the truth.